to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Today with us is Matti Friedman. He is an author of several books and many articles. One of his most famous works is the Aleppo Codex, which is basically a real-life historical mystery of sorts, but he is also well known for his account of Leonard Cohen's travels in Israel during the war. He's with us today to discuss not those books, but his article about Hezbollah-Israel tensions and whether they are in fact the front rather than Hamas that Israel should really be worried about. But I've decided to expand this question a little bit more. I've decided to look at the new fronts opening up, which include the most recent but in many ways surprising attack by the Houthis. It wasn't surprising in the fact that it happened, but it was surprising in the way it revealed new capabilities by the Houthis, and whether or not Israel should be fighting any of these proxies at all, or whether it should be directly attacking Iran, as many analysts have suggested. Matti, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we get into all of these questions, please tell us a little bit what made you decide from writing about books about spies and famous poets, lyricists, and singers, and historical non-fiction that reads like fiction, like a thriller novel, to get into this area of very controversial political analysis, controversial in part because there are so many opinions and because there seems to be no single agreement on the correct course of action in this war.
Well, of course, everything I suggest is the correct course of action. So that should clear up. It should clear up any confusion. My expertise is really not strategic analysis, and I always find myself reporting on the margins of great historical events. So that book about Leonard Cohen's concert tour in the Yom Kippur War is an example of how I like to approach great historical happenings, which is always from the margins, never the story that everyone's paying attention to, and maybe not even the stories that people think are important, but I try to find stories that exist on the periphery of people's vision and use them to illuminate the human aspect of the moment. And one of my inspirations in that regard is the great Russian novelist Vasily Grossman, who's one of my heroes. And Vasily Grossman shows us in his great works, particularly about the Second World War, that it's always a good idea to focus on the human who's caught up in the great historical conundrum. So that's just my preface for people who might expect me to be more strategically wise than I am. I do, however, have some experience in Lebanon, and the second book I wrote was called Pumpkin Flowers, and it's about my own experience as a very low-ranking infantry soldier in South Lebanon in the 1990s, in an early chapter of this war with Hezbollah. So I actually experienced it, again, not from the top, not from the strategic level, but from the bottom as a kid. Basically, I was 19 and I was guarding an outpost that was inside South Lebanon, about a half-hour drive from the Israeli border. So that's the baggage that I bring to this question. And I guess I should also add that my parents live in a town called Nahariya, which is very close to the border with Lebanon. It's actually the last town on the Israeli coast that has not been evacuated. So if you travel north from Nahariya, all the civilians have been evacuated. So my parents are also pretty close to the border, and that's also always in the back of my mind, of course. So for me, it's not really a strategic question or not a theoretical question. It's really a matter of life and death, and it's a matter of my own life and the fate of members of my family. So when I approach the question, that's the way I look at it, more, I guess, from the bottom up than from the point of view of a general or a world leader looking at a map from 2,000 feet.
So something about this engagement with Hezbollah to me doesn't smell right. Because Hezbollah opened the second front. It was escalating slowly over time. It never fully engaged Israel with the full force it could have been. We all know it's got hundreds of thousands of missiles, but just enough to essentially hold the North hostage and have thousands of Israelis evacuated since the start of the hostilities in Gaza. And then a few weeks ago, there's this sense of escalation. Everyone started talking about Israel going to direct war into Lebanon with Hezbollah within a few weeks of these events. We are hearing accounts about Israel's preparations for the war. We are hearing timelines for all of this. What is actually going on? Why has Hezbollah been allowed to operate for as long as it did at that temperature? And why is there all this talk about engagement, but nothing is happening? Should anything be happening right now?
Right, so there are things that are happening. It's true that there's not a full-scale engagement. Hezbollah isn't using all of its firepower, and neither is Israel, but there's constant combat on the northern border. As you mentioned, almost 100,000 Israelis have been evacuated from their homes along the border, and soldiers are quite regularly wounded and occasionally civilians. In Lebanon, Israel's been assassinating Hezbollah leaders and fighters, and there's a back and forth war that seems to be happening in agreed upon boundaries. So neither side is interested in really shattering the rules and sparking an all-out conflict, which could be devastating for Israel and for Lebanon. But there's some kind of limited conflict going on in the north that seems to suit Hezbollah's purposes. The reason that I think you haven't seen more action in the north on Israel's side is that and Israel doesn't like to admit it, but Israel would find it extremely difficult, maybe impossible, to wage a full-scale war on two fronts at the same time. And that's part of the problem that we've realized since October 7th, which is that our army isn't big enough. So the army is fully committed in the south. It's not that there are no forces anywhere else, but a war in Lebanon would require a real commitment of forces. The war in Lebanon would be much bigger than the war we've seen in Gaza. When you speak to experts who follow the situation in the north, they use the term 10x, meaning that the war in Lebanon is the war against Hamas in Gaza times 10. So in terms of the number of rockets that Hezbollah has, which is estimated at about 150,000, and in terms of the training of their fighters, they're a more close Iranian proxy. They're a more professional organization than Hamas, and a war there would be a real challenge. And I think Israel just does not believe that it can prosecute both wars at the same time. So the hope is that some kind of conclusion will be reached in Gaza that will allow Israel to turn its attention to the north. So there's a lot of bluster about, of course, we could fight in Lebanon if we wanted to, but I think that it's basically bluster. I don't think Israel can really do both at the same time, and would much rather do one at a time. And that's why you're seeing more limited fighting on the northern border.
And is Hezbollah aware of these limitations? I would presume to some extent it has to be.
Of course, they know, and they're trying to push the envelope as far as possible without forcing Israel to really use all of its force in Lebanon. Of course, if Israel decides to use all of its force in Lebanon, even if we don't have as many soldiers as we would like, the effects on Lebanon would be horrific. And the effects on Israel would be extremely dire as well. So the hope, I think, on Hezbollah's side is that they'll be able to keep up the pressure, express support for Hamas, do what the Iranian proxy alliance needs them to do, without risking devastation inside Lebanon, which could ultimately impact the standing of Hezbollah in Lebanon. Because one thing that Hezbollah has to take into account, which Hamas doesn't, is that Hezbollah is part of the Lebanese political system, and the Shia in Lebanon need to maneuver among other sects in Lebanon, and the Shia are the most powerful sect at this time in Lebanon, but they're not the only sect, and they're not the only sect with power. So if things explode in Lebanon, the results for Hezbollah could be negative, and I think Hezbollah would prefer not to go there. But these things have a way of getting out of control, and it would be enough to have an unlucky hit by a Hezbollah rocket to really change the calculus on Israel's side and lead the sides into a major war that I think no one here really wants.
Well, help me understand this. From the information warfare perspective, all of these engagements have been lose-lose for everybody to some extent. Hamas initially propelled a lot of axis of resistance propaganda about their early successes against Israel, but then, of course, once the leaders started dropping, with the Mohammed Deif recently being liquidated, with the Rafah being cut off from the ability to access new weapons, that leaves us them more as insurgents than a full-scale government at this point in time. Hezbollah has, it hasn't suffered these losses yet, but on the other hand, many of the Lebanese are disappointed with the domestic policies, just as Gazans have had the issues with Hamas, independent of the Israel question, and they're also seeing that Hezbollah is being cautious. So to them, that kind of undermines this resistance rhetoric. So what exactly is the game plan here? I mean, is Hezbollah committed to helping Hamas survive? Is the game plan to get Israel stuck in this endless insurgency with Hamas so that it could never open a second front against Hezbollah? How can Hezbollah actually win this from their perspective?
I think that it's important to remember that the groups, go back and say that again, just because I think it's important to remember that the Iranian proxy alliance is playing a very long game. So people in the West ask, what does victory look like? How is this supposed to conclude? But we've seen in the decades since the appearance of the Islamic theocracy in Iran and the extension of their power across the Middle East, they work very methodically and very patiently, and the game is long, and it's intended to harass Israel, to bleed Israel, to kind of afflict Israel with endless wars that come and go and defy any real conclusion. And when we see it that way, I think that a lot of this makes sense. So if we take Hezbollah in isolation and ask about their short-term goals, it's a bit hard to understand what they're doing. But if we zoom out and we see that the Iranians have a proxy in Lebanon called Hezbollah, they have forces on our northeastern border with Syria, they have proxies in Iraq, which have been firing into Israel, they have a proxy in Yemen, which has been attacking Israel, and of course they have two proxies in Gaza, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and these groups can step up the pressure and then bring the pressure down while another group steps into the vacuum. And the idea is to have Israel fighting on multiple fronts and just wearing us down. And I think that it's working. It's working. And I think the idea of a conclusive goal and a conclusive victory is kind of an old-fashioned idea that we still have, but that's not at all the way these groups are fighting. I don't think they think that they can reach a decisive victory against Israel in the short term, but I think that they realize that they can, keep hurting us over time. And if it takes 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, eventually the Crusaders pick up and go back to Europe, and that's very much the model that they're working with. I think that for Hezbollah, so far the war has been a success. They've lost a lot of people and they've lost senior people, but human life is expendable to a group like Hezbollah. What they've managed to do is change the strategic situation in northern Israel. So they've managed to push the Israeli border functionally between 5 and 7 kilometers south. They've managed to depopulate a huge swath of northern Israel, which is a very dangerous precedent. And they've managed to arrive at an equation where they're firing rockets and missiles into sovereign Israeli territory, hitting Israeli cities, and living to tell the tale, right? Israel's kind of containing it rather than hitting them really hard in response. So I think so far for Hezbollah, it's going quite well. As they say here, I'm not sure if this is a translation of a saying from another language, but they say that you count the money in the stairs. I'm not sure if that makes sense in another language, but what that means is that you don't count your money from the poker game when you're sitting at the table. You count it when you leave and go down the stairs. And here too, I think we'll be able to gauge the real effects of this war in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. It's a bit hard to see right now.
Was this always an inevitable course of events? In other words, were Israel's military numbers always the factor that would leave it vulnerable to this encirclement strategy? Or was it something that could have been prevented with better planning, more awareness, and avoiding all these military and intelligence and policy mistakes that we've all been discussing since October 7th?
It's a great question, and a lot of us have been asking it. And I think that our understanding of what was going on was flawed. And I also think that Israel's Achilles heel is that we're fundamentally an optimistic society that wants to live life and would rather not fight. And I think we had an interest in telling ourselves after each round of violence that round of violence was over, and now we could keep living. And we had a mini war in Gaza in 2021. And as soon as it was over, no one remembered that it happened. And we had, of course, many previous rounds in Gaza, including 2014, 2008-9, and we had a pretty nasty war with Hezbollah in 2006. And before that, we had fighting with Hezbollah throughout the 80s and 90s. And I think we told ourselves convenient stories about what our enemies wanted and about the extent to which they're contained. It's actually really interesting to read a quote from Jabotinsky, the great revisionist Zionist leader in the 20s. And he writes after, or he's giving a speech that you can read after one of the first rounds of Arab violence against Jews in what was then British Mandate Palestine. And he says the problem with the Jews is that they're optimists. They think the violence is over. They don't understand that the violence is in the future, so they're not preparing for more violence. And the idea that the Jews' optimism or their hope for a better future is actually an Achilles heel is a very depressing thought, because of course we want to build a society that's based on hope. The national anthem of Israel is literally called The Hope. Hatikva means the hope. So the country is very much a forward-looking project. And I think in this case, it really caused us incredible damage because we closed our eyes to what was going on in Gaza. Hamas has always been very explicit about their goals. And we decided not to believe them, and we, had a border that was barely defended on October 7th, and these were grave errors of judgment. The problem is that if you really look at what's happening in the Middle East and tell yourself the truth about it, then it can be very depressing, and it's not conducive to optimism and forward motion. So somehow Israelis are going to have to both look the Middle East in the eyes and respond to what the region is, and also maintain a bubble in which we can move forward and build good lives for ourselves. And that's going to be, it's not going to be easy, but it's, I think, what will be necessary for Israel in the next generation.
Isn't it accurate to say that there's a fundamental misalignment of agendas here, in the sense that for these proxies, resistance, the process of resistance is in itself a goal. It's a good in itself, regardless of the end result down, 50 years down the road. The very fact that they're able to yield these blows to the Zionist entity is the recruitment process that keeps them going with their own domestic audiences who may be disillusioned in every other aspect of life, but at least there is this. And every time things get a little bit worse on a social level, they can attack Israel and say, but look, we're still fighting the Zionist entity and the fight is not over. So they're feeding these delusions to their own populations, and that's what keeps them going eternally. And in light of this, if this is the case, isn't it a mistake on Israel's part to treat this endless process as something that is that can never end? That's something that aren't they playing along into the terrorist hands by not dealing, one deadly blow instead of fighting to contain? Isn't containment strategy in itself a loss, if we frame it this way?
Yes, I think that you're right. And a very interesting book about this for me, as someone who comes from a more Western set of assumptions and then had to really learn that I was wrong about almost everything. A really interesting book was written by Naim Qassem, who's one of the Hezbollah leaders. And he writes a book that's published in English, and he explains that the goal is not to defeat Israel. It's to create a resistance society. Mm-hmm. That as you said, the act of resistance is not a tool. It's the end. That's what they want. So the war is not going to be over. It's not like you have a war in the Western understanding. You have a war and it achieves its goal and then everyone goes home. That's not what groups like Hezbollah and Hamas are talking about, and not what the Taliban is talking about, and not what ISIS or Al Qaeda are talking about. They have a different idea of what life is, and life involves sacrifice and jihad. And the war against Zionism or the war against America are almost more a tool than an end. They're meant to create a society of resistance. And yes, I think we need to really look at that and think about what it means. It's not that you can't defeat ideologies, and of course, the classic example is Nazism, which is a very powerful ideology in Germany, and eventually it's defeated. So I think it's not like we need to give up. And I think that it's important that particularly people on the left who have a more liberal set of expectations and a more kind of liberal analysis of what's going on, I think it's very important for those people, and I would put myself in that camp, to look very carefully at this and understand that we can no longer tell ourselves nice liberal fantasies about what's going on in the Middle East. We need to be very clear-eyed about it. And liberalism will not mean inventing a fantasy world where a two-state solution is possible and then will lead to a regional peace accord in 2024. Being liberal means looking at the Middle East, understanding exactly what it is, understanding what you said about the resistant society, understanding who our enemies really are, and given those limitations, create a country that is as liberal as possible for those of us who live here, Jews, Muslims, Christians, Druze, and whoever else happens to be hanging around. But I think you're right that a real shift in consciousness has to happen to a very large extent. I think it has happened in Israel, just because we're very close to the events, and October 7th was a lesson that Israelis just could not ignore. But in the West, understanding is lagging behind maybe 20 years. And you still hear people talking about a two-state solution, and you still hear Western leaders using that same language, which is really part of the mythology of the 1990s. And it means very little to people here on either side, but it lives on in the West.
To what extent does the Israeli leadership understand it, and to what extent does the Israeli public understand this issue? The reason I'm asking is that the Netanyahu government has consistently saying, when the war is over, we will have elections. When the war is over, we will reconsider everything that we went through. And I'm not talking about Netanyahu's political future, that's a separate discussion. I'm talking about the examination of the military strategy and Israel's military alignment. When the war is over, we'll start the investigation of who was responsible for the initial. But, from that perspective, the war is never going to be over. And to add a layer of complexity to something that's already not very simple, Fatah and Hamas just signed a unity agreement in China, which was for many years a complete failure with many different actors trying to mediate. All of a sudden, these two groups sign a unity agreement, which gives Hamas a lifeline. It puts Fatah into Hamas' hands. It indicates Iran's increasing successes in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and it brings this conflict into a different layer, because the plan from the US perspective was to put in PA in charge of Gaza after Hamas leadership is done away with, whatever that means. Now we're not sure that this is going to be, that this narrative could be successful, given that there's no choices. There's one entity which includes Hamas, one anti-Israel front which is dedicated to continuing to try to destroy Israel. If you leave Gaza, this is what's going to happen. They're going to be back to the fighting together jointly. So that means permanent occupation by whom? Nobody knows, because I don't know who except for Israel and maybe possibly Egypt is going to commit actual forces. So to what extent are we talking reality here, with the Israeli leadership, with Israelis, with the US, with everyone looking at this conflict?
Yeah, there's not a lot of reality, at least publicly discussed. Everyone has a kind of an investment in a fantasy. The American leadership has an old investment in the two-state fantasy, and of course, there's this fantasy that Palestinian unity between Fatah and Hamas will somehow lead somewhere good. And I'm very skeptical about what that agreement actually is, just because there've been these attempts to create Palestinian unity over the past 20 years, and they've never worked. So I'm not too worried about that at the moment, although I do think that it's important to realize that the idea that the Palestinian Authority is a moderate peace partner, I mean, that's also just 90s mythology. The support for October 7th is extremely high across the spectrum among Palestinians, and you can look at polling information, and I have no illusions about either of the sides of the Palestinian political spectrum. And if Hamas is in power, if there's a unity government in power, then Hamas, of course, just kind of does its thing under the surface and attacks when it sees fit. And even if it's officially Fatah that's in power, Hamas will be there underground, both figuratively and literally. And I think Hamas in many ways would like a situation that's more like Hezbollah in Lebanon, where they're not responsible for governance. because being responsible for governance is a real headache, and they might prefer to have some kind of veneer of international respectability that would allow the aid money to keep flowing, while under the civilian landscape of Gaza, they continue their military activities, freed from the the pain in the neck of running the sewage system and running the education system to the extent that they do. So I think that's also a fantasy that we need to be disabused of. And I think that as far as the Israeli government is concerned, their interest, Netanyahu's interest, is in avoiding responsibility for what happened. And he has an interest in not reaching that moment where the investigations start. And he has an interest in a long war. And I'm not saying that the war would be short were he not in power, but I certainly don't trust his motivations here. And I think he's also not being truthful with the public, and quite possibly not being truthful with himself. So I think that one of the sad aspects of this time, not just in Israel, but in America and maybe everywhere, is that there's so much dishonesty around. And it's so rare to hear a leader who actually says what they mean. And, we don't have leaders who respect the electorate enough to tell them the truth about the health of the president, about the state of the war in Gaza, about the state of the border, between Israel and Gaza from looking at October 7th, about the state of the Israeli army, about what we can and cannot really do against our enemies. And there's a lot of lying going on, and I think that it's going to be very hard to get out of our current predicament without brutal honesty about what's gone wrong, who's responsible, and how we start to fix things. And that will require a different leadership in Israel, and I'd like to see a different leadership in the United States as well. But that's beyond my power as an Israeli. I think we need a different kind of leadership, and it's very much one that will explode those myths that you're mentioning, and go back to a very cold, hard description of reality. Because without that, we'll never be able to deal with reality or solve any of the problems that have become apparent in the last 9 months.
Given the fact that China appears probably with a good assistance from other places like Iran, has managed to accomplish the seemingly impossible, bring these long-standing enemies into a unity against Israel, and managed to overcome whatever internal differences they used to have. Is the South Front, was it ever winnable given the involvement of these actors manipulating behind the scenes and lending their weight to these proxies? And clearly it's not just Iran, though. Iran is certainly a major interested party in this, and I'll get to that. But right now I want to see, given China's role, given Russia's role, given Iran's role, given even North Korea selling weapons to these groups, given that they have also even substantial now diplomatic backing from around the world, with multiple countries recognizing the state of Palestine despite these movements, is the South Front something that is it lost essentially to this international network of anti-Israel forces?
I think that's Hamas was actually very smart in the way they handled this attack. And I wrote a piece for the Free Press a few months ago called The Wisdom of Hamas, which is kind of a response to the idea that October 7th was a Hamas miscalculation. It was very common to hear that in the first weeks or months after October 7th. People were saying this was a mistake because now everyone sees what Hamas did in Israel on October 7th, and Israel will have legitimacy to respond, and Hamas is finished, and what were they thinking? And I think 9 months in, it's quite easy to see that they were reading the international situation quite adeptly, and they had a lot more allies than I think we understood here in Israel. They have allies, of course, across the Muslim world, but they also have allies in places like China and Russia, which have quite explicitly come down on their side. And they have allies in the many, many millions of people in the West who are increasingly amenable to the kind of, Islamic militancy that Hamas is pushing, which in the West is often misunderstood in a kind of ludicrous way as part of a post-colonial battle for freedom or something like that. So they definitely had a read on the international situation that was pretty solid, and they understood that they could carry out a mass terror attack in Israel, but that what people would really care about is the Israeli response, and that would swing public opinion against Israel, and that they would both enjoy increasing support in the West while also getting very solid support from the actors that you mentioned, like China, which seemed to have pretty good relations with Israel before October 7th, and Russia. Netanyahu was very proud of his his relationship with Putin, and there was a big poster in Jerusalem where I live a year or two back, showing Netanyahu shaking hands with Putin and shaking hands with Trump as a way of showing that Netanyahu was an adept leader on the international stage and kind of hobnobbing with the highest level of international leader. And all of those relations turned out to be worth very little after October 7th. So I think it's going to be difficult for Israel to, not impossible, but difficult for Israel to maneuver given the kind of support that Hamas has. I mean, in a very interesting aside, another piece that I wrote about 2 years ago, everything's very blurry because the pace of events 3 years ago, is about Israel's third port. We've always had two big ports, and a third opened up a couple years ago in the city of Haifa, and it's a Chinese port. It's run by the same company that runs the port in Shanghai, and it's a Chinese Communist Party company. And there's a very tangled web of interest here. Chinese companies do a lot of the infrastructure work in Israel. Israel's been kind of brought into the outer limits of the Chinese economic orbit in the past 10 or 20 years. And that's also part of the very complicated calculation of Mideast politics, which is no longer, the Cold War politics of America versus the Soviet Union as it would have been until the 80s. Things are much, much more complicated. And I think that you're right. They're not working in Israel's favor.
But whether Israel likes it or not, it is being drawn into the new Cold War. Not that the old one ever really ended, but the new phase of the Cold War, which is much more complicated even for the US. Is Israel prepared to play an active role, to take open sides, to come out against China, Russia, and that whole network as one entity, as opposed to trying to maintain some form of separate, independent relations?
It's a great question, and I've been thinking about that a lot because Israel was trying to maintain some kind of ambiguity in the middle, and we really saw it in Ukraine when the Western world was really being very public about condemning Russia. And Israel, although it did take actions against Russia in a quiet way, Israel was not part of the kind of choir that was very clear about the nature of the invasion of Ukraine. And part of that was to maintain this ambiguous position. And part of it is because we have Russian military forces on our northeastern border in Syria. And that has to be managed. But the age of ambiguity, I think, is ending or has ended. And it really depends to a large extent on what happens in America in November. So if you have an American leadership that is very clear about its policies and taking a very hard line against the powers that you mentioned, I think Israel will be much more likely to join that kind of alliance, because I think that the ambiguity that Israel was trying to maintain hasn't paid off. I mean, as soon as push came to shove, the Russians and the Chinese were on the side of Hamas. So I'm not sure that the advantages in maintaining ambiguity are the same as they were 2 or 3 years ago. But if there's an American administration from either party that is out to lunch, which has been the case for several years, and not being, not taking some kind of clear stand and not leading the free world in a very clear direction, then I don't think we can expect Israel to lead the charge in that regard. Israel will probably follow the American lead. And at the moment, it's hard to see an American leader that would provide the kind of clarity that everyone's looking for. And I mean that looking at the probable candidates from both countries. So Israel's going to have to play a very complicated and a very dangerous game as it manages its immediate enemies like Hamas and Hezbollah and tries to stay afloat in an increasingly chaotic international system.
To be honest, both parties in the US have not been honest with themselves or with the public about the fact that this network is one and the same, and they share assets, they share strategy, and they share an anti-Western and anti-Israel position. Trump has been very much leaning and surrounded by pro-Russian forces, and Kamala Harris, who's right now the most likely Democratic nominee, she's been maintaining Biden's line, which in itself has been quite ambiguous even in Russia. But on Iran, the Democrats have been very clear they're not ready to confront it directly, which leaves Israel in a bind. Whoever ends up in the White House is likely not going to be dealing with part of the equation here. but that doesn't mean that Israel, for its own interests, doesn't have to. So this partial blindness to the fact that these people are actually operating together, how can Israel confront this while balancing its political relations with the US in particular and others, European Union as well?
It's going to be extremely difficult. And it's hard to know exactly what the relationship between the Israeli leadership and the next American president will be, because we don't know who the president will be. And I think there might be more surprises in this race. I mean, so much is happening in American politics every day that who knows who the candidates will ultimately be. And then, of course, we don't know who will win or what kind of tack that they'll take. I think that Israel's dream candidate would be someone like John McCain, some kind of centrist, security hawk, whether Republican or Democrat. I don't think Israel really cares if it's a Republican or a Democrat. Unfortunately, that vintage of American leaders seems to be gone, and we have different kinds of leaders who are pursuing policies that I think are not good for Israel, and I think Israel's views are not necessarily going to align with the United States policy. So it's not like I'm criticizing Americans for doing what's best for America. I'm just commenting as an Israeli from a very narrow perspective here. Both the conciliatory and very naive posture of the Democratic Party, that's bad for Israel, and it has emboldened the Iranians. And part of what's happening now is that we're paying the price for the way the Iranians have been incentivized since the years of the Obama administration. We're kind of paying the bill for that right now. We're under attack from Iranian proxies on a half dozen fronts, and that wasn't true 20 years ago. At the same time, I think in America led by a character like Trump, who's incredibly unpredictable and capricious and amenable to influences of different kinds. Some of them quite opaque, and some of them, vaguely Russian smelling. I think that's also not great for Israel. So I think that we're going to need an incredibly talented and adept leadership to navigate the minefield that's coming. And at the moment, we don't have it. So the leadership that will be able to maintain unity in Israeli society, keep our allies on side, and prevent war, I see that those three goals as the primary goals of an Israeli prime minister. We don't have that prime minister at the moment, and a lot is riding not just on the US election, but a lot is riding on what happens in the Israeli political system over the next couple months. If we can elect a new leadership that can more effectively address the West, then I think that we'll be in better shape. I think that we have a very strong case to make about this war being really a war for Western civilization against the forces of barbarism. And I don't use those terms lightly or without some cynicism, but I think we can really make that case. The problem is we can't make that case in the liberal West with the current government in Israel, which includes actors who are, they have a lot more in common. Some of the components of the Israeli government, they have a lot more in common with Hamas than they do with Hegel, and I think that's a real problem for us. We really need Western support. We need to be close to the democratic world at the moment. And the fantasies that Netanyahu was spreading around for many years, that we needed the democracies less and we needed the Americans less because we would have new friends, for example, Russia and China. And that whole idea has really collapsed, and we need some way of effectively placing ourselves in the democratic camp. And, while we are forced to conduct wars that are extremely upsetting and horrific and controversial among governments and electorates in the West. So it's going to be a very difficult trick to pull off over the next couple of years. I think we can do it because Israel has pulled off a lot of neat and very complicated tricks in the almost 8 decades of its existence. But I think that we'll need a very talented and flexible leadership, and it's not the leadership that we currently have.
So that leads me to the question, should the Gaza war be the war Israel is fighting right now? Given the political complications, given that instead of going into Rafah quickly, cutting off weapons, Israel pursued other directions first, had to fight through all this urban warfare scenarios that were extremely slow-moving and difficult, and ended up being politically delegitimized in the process? Is it even, and given now that there's a lot of according to the post, a lot of the IDF contingent in Gaza doesn't even want to continue fighting there, or sees it as a lost war, or sees a two-state solution as some sort of a plausible alternative. Is that the war that Israel should be focusing on it? Should it be the Northern Front? Or, to add more complications, we are now seeing cookies who have always been there. Whether or not the Israeli military establishment wants to admit, they were always there. They were always hostile to both Jews and Israel. Just look at their slogans. But they were focused on more domestic and regional issues until they didn't have to, until they engaged in peace talks with the Saudis, with the Yemen government, thanks to pressure from the US, thanks to regional dynamics, thanks to normalization with Iran, and they could focus all their efforts on Israel with Iran's prompting. And now we are seeing they're getting very sophisticated weapons from Russia. They're developing capabilities of their own. They're capable of striking well into Israel and not just the South. So is that the front that's going to be dominant? Are either of those scenarios going to be more of a problem even than the South? Are they more winnable or less winnable?
Yeah, those are all great questions. I'm not really sure I'm the right person to answer them. Strategy is not my strong suit anyway, and even I think the great strategists have been looking pretty stupid over the past year or the past couple years. I do wonder if Israel's response to October 7th was the correct response, given that we now understand that we're under attack from an Iranian proxy system. And given that that is the case, is it a good idea to be drawn into the mud by each individual proxy and forced into these wars that look terrible, that inflame public opinion in the West and force us to commit a lot of troops over a lot of time for achievements that might end up being more modest than we'd hoped? And the other option is to, as some Israelis some leaders in the political system and in the military system say, the other option is to attack the head of the snake. If you have a proxy system that's being run from Tehran, and they're at war with us, right? They're doing it in a smart way, and they have an arrangement where they attack us through their proxies, and we're not allowed to attack them back. And I think that arrangement needs to be ended. And part of what the calculation is that a war with Iran is obviously a very serious business. And part of it is that I think it's quite clear that the Americans are telling the leadership of Israel that it is not allowed to do that. And the Americans have been trying to reach some kind of rapprochement with the Iranians for quite some time, starting with the Obama administration, and some of the figures from the Obama administration are carried over into the Biden administration. And there's this idea that Iran can be incentivized into good behavior, and that Israel will not be allowed to disrupt that possibility. And it's really trapped us in a situation where we're forced to fight on Iranian terms. The Iranians have us where they want us. We're being drawn into wars with their proxies. The victims of these wars are Palestinians and Lebanese and people who the Iranians don't care about, and they'll sacrifice them without blinking, while the Iranians themselves do not pay any significant price. If the Iranians were losing oil fields, if they were losing military installations, if they were losing their fleet, and if they were losing their nuclear facilities, they might think differently about attacking Israel. And I think looking back, at the post-October 7th landscape, I'm not sure that this course of action was the right one, although in defense of the Israeli government, which is, as you might have noticed, a government that I don't like very much, in their defense, I think that they were getting very clear directives from the Americans about what was and was not permissible after October 7th. And I think that went a long way to dictating Israel's course of action.
Well, this is not the first time Israel has been under the pressure from the US administration throughout history. There's nothing unique about US interfering, but there's a huge difference now. Between now and what happened in 1973, what happened before that, in various other confrontations, the difference is Iran is about to be nuclear, and it also has friends who are nuclear powers. Given the realities, given that the more time passes, the more sophisticated weapons Iran is able to either develop or obtain from other parties, isn't it a sort of an existential question of trying to disrupt this process before it gets so out of hand that it is irreversible, and before Iran and company gain such military superiority in the region that Israel cannot fully overcome that.
Absolutely. I think that's true. And I think that if you look back at the decade and a half of Netanyahu's leadership, you'll see that Netanyahu is not a big decision maker. He generally responds to events. He tries to kick the can down the road. There was probably a window to attack Iran, maybe about 10 years ago, when Iron Dome was already online and the Iranians were far from where they are now. And ultimately, I think Netanyahu doesn't make big decisions. And he allowed Hamas to grow to monstrous proportions in Gaza, and told himself some story about containment, and preferred, Mossad skullduggery in Iran, which seems to have maybe slowed the Iranians down, but not stopped them. And I think that that's one of the big questions looking back at his time in power is how did he let this happen? Was that the right decision? And his issue has always been Iran. He's been talking about Iran since the 1990s. He can credibly claim to have been among the first to realize that the Iranians were the coming threat. And he's on record as saying this, very, very, very early on, when no one was really thinking about the Iranians. So he's right. But I mean, just in terms of what we know, he's failed to stop that.
Let me put it this way. As much as US likes to pressure Israel, what would they do if Israel, without Israel carrying out some of these policies? Yes, they pressure Israel and Iran, but let's imagine a scenario where Israel decided to disobey instructions, attacked Iran, destroyed very significant capabilities, and rendered it virtually useless, including for the shipping industry that is harming US interests, including for various other practices. Would US really be so angry if Iran became substantially weakened and became less of a problem for the US? Or are they simply afraid of Israel it turning into a public embarrassment and a problem if Israel did not succeed? Is that the real concern of the administration? Would they really sanction the entire Israeli leadership if Iran somehow became less of a problem for real? Is that a real threat that Israel should be worried about here?
I think what Israel needs to take into consideration is the American kind of international umbrella, the veto in the Security Council, for example, and in very practical terms, the arms supply. So if America comes to Israel and says, listen, if you guys start a war with Iran, that's a regional war, and we're not going to back you. That is, once your current supply of 2,000-pound bombs and Iron Dome interceptors and different kinds of ammunition that Israel needs to get from the United States, because Israel doesn't have its own capacity to produce most of those munitions. If America says that to Israel, then there's not a lot that Israel can do. So it's not, if the model is the strike on the Iraqi nuclear reactor at Osirak, then we imagine kind of a strike that happens and then ends, or the strike against the Syrian nuclear reactor that was just kind of taken out very quietly, did not lead to a regional war. So Israel could do it with or without American permission. And in the case of Iraq, Israel did not have American permission, but it didn't lead to a broader war in which Israel desperately needed American help. And so if Israel starts a regional war against the express instructions of the American administration, and I do believe that that was the case now, then there could be dire repercussions 2 months down the line when Israel is getting hit by hundreds of cruise missiles and suicide drones, as we saw, and the Americans aren't coming up with the material that we need to fight it. So there's a very real sense in which Israel, in the current state of affairs, really needs to take into account American support. It's not just a matter of the American administration getting pissed off and writing an angry letter and maybe withdrawing an ambassador. We could start a war that leads us into a very sticky situation that lasts longer than our arms supply does, and then we need American support, or we need Western support, and we wouldn't have it. And I think that's taking those considerations into account. Again, I'm not saying this as a fan of Netanyahu, but he needs to take that consideration into account, and I think he is. And I think that there might have been a window where a real decision could have been made. A different Israeli leader might have made it. Ehud Barak, 10 years ago or 12 years ago, whenever it was that he was in the government with Netanyahu, I think was pushing for it. I think he's a guy who does make decisions. And at the time, it would have led to some kind of conflagration, but we might have been in better shape now. I think if you let your enemies grow to monstrous proportions in order to buy quiet, then in the end you pay the price for it. And I think we're really paying the price for it now for short-term thinking.
So in other words, Israel is stuck with no good options. The reality is, even if the correct thing to do is to strike at Iran, Israel has no independent capacity to do so on its own in the long term, and no, for the time being, at least no U.S. backing with potential serious repercussions. And on the other hand, those proxies are running their own show with Iran's direction, and Israel is stuck responding in various ways because the other option is not available. It has no option but to be drawn into the proxy war so long as it is limited and unable to strike Iran directly.
I think that's more or less true, again, to the best of my knowledge. And I'll say again as a caveat that I'm not a strategic expert of any kind, and I don't have access to the inner discussions of the Israeli government. But I think that does seem like an accurate summary of the strategic situation, one which could change dramatically in November. And I think that it's quite clear that Netanyahu and his allies are hoping to make it to November. They're hoping to make it to November and to see a different kind of American leadership that might look differently at the possibility of Israeli action. We saw, Trump in his term in office take out Soleimani, which was the right move and move that Israel really appreciated. I'm not sure that we can count on Trump's strategic wisdom at every moment, but I think that the Israeli leadership is hoping that a different American leadership might be less bound by the fantasies that have shaped this administration vis-a-vis Iran and the broader outcome in the Middle East.
So at the end of the day, Israel right now is a passive responder to Iranian initiatives. By Iranian, I mean it's the entire network. In other words, it cannot choose its own wars. It can only respond to them, and even there the choices are limited. Do you focus all your efforts on one of those proxies with the hope of destroying them, or do you try to contain them on multiple fronts? Do you go all in somewhere that's politically complicated and unlikely to be destroyable due to the evolving dynamic? At what point does Israel decide that it can no longer afford to simply react to what's happening and take a more dramatic initiative? Because the 10 months that passed since October 7th, during that time, the dynamic in Gaza has changed with the greater involvement of assorted outside parties, with the loss of international backing, with this new unity government. Can't the same happen with the Hezbollah, with Houthis? Can't they gain new allies that will make them, despite their unpalatable activities, make them more powerful political forces?
I think that it will take time to know exactly how this is being interpreted. I agree that Israel cannot maintain its passive posture where we're just sitting behind our high-tech fences and telling ourselves lies about our enemies. I think we need to be much more active, and I think we need to kind of relearn the lessons that Israel's army knew in the 50s about aggressive and unexpected action, about hitting your enemy when in a way that they're not expecting, about incentivizing people to be your enemy, to be your allies, and making people afraid of you, about being less heavy and more light on our feet. And I think that all has to be, that all has to happen. Although I think we'll see in a year or 2 or 3 how the Gaza war will be remembered. I mean, Hamas has been dealt incredible damage, and we can get depressed about whether or not Israel has achieved its goals in Gaza, but Hamas has been hit very, very hard, and Gaza has been hit very, very hard, and the lessons of this war might not be reflected by the very defiant statements of Hamas leaders and Qatar. And we'll see how the Palestinians really remember this war in 2 years, and whether they really think it's a good idea to have another one. And we'll see how the war is interpreted by people in Lebanon. Maybe they don't want Lebanon to look like Gaza. Or maybe this might be interpreted in a way that's different than our pessimistic take at the moment, but I think that only time will tell.
Well, thank you so much for this very sobering but thought-provoking analysis, which I think needs to be heard badly in the US, in Israel, and elsewhere. And let's hope that the best course of action ends up emerging, and wise decision making in political circumstances finally align at some point. Because we cannot afford any more mistakes of the October 7th caliber. It's not just October 7th, it's the entire regional realignment that has been resulting over some time before October 7th and afterwards as well. And thank you so much for joining us, and best of luck in your future research, which I'm sure your future work is going to be just as compelling, interesting, and unexpected as the stories you have shared with us up until now.
Thank you very much, Anna. It was a real pleasure speaking to you.
And for everyone else watching, we'll be back same time next week, Tuesday night, 9 p.m. The Washington Outsider Report on the